Oregon's new gun control law, Measure 114, are on pause again until at least December 23rd. Today, a Harney County judge extended two parts of the law. The judge wants the state to be ready to handle the permit to purchase part of the law before he lets it actually take effect.
Both sides are also trying to come to an agreement on background checks. Next week, they will meet again to continue the discussion. It's really a lot to keep track of, and it's constantly changing, and that's why we brought in political science professor Jim Moore. Jim is live for us tonight to help us understand some of the political implications of these court challenges. So, Jim, let's start with the state is still working on getting parts of the new law ready. How can a measure be allowed to actually go to the voters in the first place when there's serious fundamental questions about implementing it or even if it's constitutional?
Yeah, when a measure is being put together, it doesn't become law until the people pass it. And so often when things are going through the legislative process, you get all that lined up. So, for instance, if this were going through the legislature, they'd pass it. They'd say, oh, my gosh, do we have the ability at the local level to do the background checks? They'd balance all that. But when it's a ballot measure that comes from the people, it doesn't have to go through that process. And remember, it can't be challenged to its constitutionality or to whether it's a valid law under our Constitution until it actually is passed and becomes a law. And so that's where we are right now at both the federal level. Does it go with the Second Amendment of the Constitution? And at the state level where it fits with our own Constitution and our own state laws.
Jim, if this law is eventually overturned, the courts would be overruling the will of the voters, even though it passed with a narrow margin. How often has this happened?
It doesn't happen that often, but it does happen. People with long memories may remember that we, the people of Oregon, several times have passed things like campaign finance reform that has been thrown out by the courts. Just 2 years ago, we finally changed the Constitution to say, no, we can have campaign finance laws. We also have thrown out term limits because the courts eventually ruled, no, that doesn't fit with Oregon's Constitution. So it does happen, a little bit higher average of it happening with these ballot measures because they're trying to push the limits of Oregon law and Oregon constitutional interpretation, and then the system pushes back to see if everything works. So it has happened before, but it's relatively rare.
Jim, lastly, we want to take a look at a map of which counties approved Measure 114 and which ones didn't. Another illustration of the urban-rural divide in Oregon. The population centers voted yes, and more sparsely populated areas voted no. If Measure 114 is upheld, do you see more political battles over this in the future?
Yeah, we're already seeing them. Remember, at the local level, several sheriffs have said they will not enforce the magazine limits that are part of this law. And so that'll be worked out at the local level, and then the state level will come in. But gun control and gun safety is something that's a national issue. It's certainly big here in Oregon. Because of our ballot measure system where people can do the signatures and get it on the ballot, Oregon will continue to be at the front of the states that are dealing with that because so many people are fed up with the mass murders and so many other people are saying, no, you're infringing on my right to have a gun. And so that conversation will continue in Oregon regardless of the outcome of this particular law.
Even though the permitting process to buy a gun has been put on hold, the legal expert I spoke to today says there is a way for the rest of Measure 114 to move forward. Lewis and Clark law professor Tung Yin explains the authors of bills like Measure 114 usually think ahead in case one part of the law is struck down.
Generally, if you have a law with multiple parts to it, the authors of the bill will typically think about this in advance. Like, what happens if there's a problem? If Part A turns out to be invalid, do we want Parts B and C to go forward? And if they do, then they'll write into it a severability clause.
A severability clause is a provision that keeps the remaining portions of a law in force should a court declare one or more of its provisions unconstitutional, void, or unenforceable. And we confirmed Measure 114 does have a severability clause, which reads in part, quote, "And to this end, the provisions of this act are severable," which creates a way for other parts of the narrowly approved measure to take effect.
It would just mean that, so it may be that one part of it does create a Second Amendment type of problem, and that part would be invalid, but the other parts that do not create Second Amendment problems would be allowed to go forward.
The federal court ruling only put a hold on the permit to purchase process, while Harney County's temporary restraining order puts all parts on hold until legal challenges are cleared up. So if you're walking into a gun store right now, you don't have to worry about getting that permit before you can buy a gun. But that doesn't mean that other parts of Measure 114 might soon apply when you go to pick up a gun.
The death penalty is a failed policy. It doesn't actually achieve the outcome that people think or have been sort of falsely led to believe that it does.
It's a cheap stunt, frankly, because there are many things that are just flat out wrong about it.
Tonight, 17 death row inmates are no longer on death row. Governor Kate Brown commuted their sentences today, turning those sentences into life in prison without the possibility of parole. Good evening. Thanks for joining us for K2 News at 11 o'clock. I'm Deborah Knapp. K2's Francis Lynn is live for us tonight. So, Fran, what more can you tell us?
Deb, Oregon's only ever executed 2 people in modern history, and the state has been under a moratorium since 2011.
17 people will no longer face lethal injection for the crimes they committed after Governor Brown's decision today. In a statement, she said, in part, justice is not advanced by taking a life, something the Oregon Justice Resource Center agrees with.
Research has shown it's not a deterrent to crime. It's a waste of money and resources. Often these cases will go for decades without any resolution.
On the other hand, House Republican leader Vicky Brees-Iverson expressed her objection in a statement saying, in part, the governor's decisions do not consider the impact the victims and families will suffer, something Joshua Markey, who was the district attorney in Astoria, sympathizes with.
And I already have calls from victims' families going, what's going on? Does this mean the man who killed our parents is still going to be in prison? And the answer is no, because the governor doesn't have the power to extend a sentence.
He says he doesn't believe this will help victims' families.
My understanding is no effort was made to contact any of the victims. This is dropping out of the sky like a thunderbolt on a sunny day. And then, for example, Randy Guzik, who I put on death row, he committed the murders in 1987. So his sentence, unfortunately, is now subject to parole. I wish it wasn't, but that's the law.
Randy Guzik, one of the people on death row, was convicted of murdering a couple during a burglary. Another notable duo are Bruce and Joshua Turnage, father and son, who bombed a bank and killed 2 law enforcement officers. While they were all on death row, Bobbin Singh points out how the state hasn't successfully executed anyone in modern history except 2 people in 96 and 97
were volunteers that gave up their appeals.
So he says the death penalty does not help all victims' families.
The illusion or the myth that's been created that there's actually some sort of end to this, it just doesn't exist. So for victim family members, this is something that ends up dragging on for decades. Today is a good day for Oregonians, and I hope Oregonians feel proud of the fact that we can, slowly move to end this chapter in our state.